My next speaker is Danielle Resnick. She is a senior research fellow here at IFPRI, and she's going to take us to Africa. She's going to tell us about informal workers in the urban food sector in Africa.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. So in contrast to the previous two speakers, I'm going to focus on a much narrower topic. And as the title suggests, it's on the governance of informal food vendors in African cities. And the reason I'm just focusing regionally on Africa is because many project that Africa is the fastest urbanizing region of the world. It's expected to hit its urban transition point in about 15 years. And this is when you'll have a majority of people living in urban areas, especially in southern, west, and central Africa. And you'll have governments managing cities of 5 million to 10 million or more people. Some of these cities are considered fragile cities, so Kinshasa or Luanda or Lagos. And so we know there's a number of governance challenges in these cities in terms of infrastructure, housing, but one of the main concerns is how will we feed Africa's cities? There's been a lot of excitement about the growth of supermarkets in the region, and I think that excitement is well-founded. But I wanted to advocate a little bit more for looking at the potential of the informal food sector, and particularly informal food vendors. They've long been the linchpin of urban food security for decades, but their potential could really be enhanced if they faced a better enabling environment. Now, how are they important for urban food security? Well, on the one hand, vis-a-vis supermarkets, they offer greater access for the urban poor. Of course, informal markets and street hawkers, for example, offer greater proximity to busy urbanites than supermarkets that might be located further away. Relatedly, greater affordability for the urban poor. Prices are lower from informal vendors. You can buy in smaller quantities, which is really important for people who may lack refrigeration. One study finds that across 11 southern African cities, the informal food sector is the main source of food purchases for 70% of urban households. So it really is a critical source for the urban poor. And it's also critical through the income and employment channel, particularly for women, because within the informal sector, women are disproportionately concentrated in the food subsector of the informal economy. But we shouldn't forget that they're really critical in terms of agricultural distribution. They're the ones out there retailing fresh produce, dairy products, groundnuts. And for international agribusiness companies, they use the informal sector to really engage in market segmentation in order to have smaller quantities, greater price discrimination. So Nestle, for example, contracts informal vendors in South Africa and in Nigeria to vend ice cream. We know the company Parmalat in Senegal, it contracts informal vendors for selling small milk sachets on the streets of Dakar. And I think most importantly, they're really critical for strengthening domestic value chains. It's your informal food vendors who are out there selling locally processed foods and drinks. I think given the many advantages that the informal sector, particularly the informal food sector, provides, what's a bit troubling is the lack of an enabling environment that they face, and particularly the ambivalence of African governments toward the sector. We see a lot of erratic enforcement of colonial-era bylaws on street vending. This creates a lot of unpredictability for the informal sector. Because it's a region that's facing greater decentralization, you often see a tussle over whether it's municipal authorities or national authorities who really have the mandate over managing informal vending. And I think when you look at some of the recent crackdown campaigns in African cities, you really see this notion of informal vendors being enemies, being illegal, even being dirty in some ways. So you look at the titles of some of these campaigns: Keep Lusaka Clean and Healthy campaign, South Africa's Operation Clean Sweep, Nigeria's Zero Tolerance, Zimbabwe's Remove the Rubbish campaign. I just came back from Ghana on Monday. They just started Operation Crossing the Red Line campaign to push food vendors off the street. So it's this notion that they're kind of going to war with informal food vendors. Many vendors are arrested, fined, and have their merchandise confiscated. So this is giving a graphic. It's looking at across the informal sector, so beyond just the food sector, and using data from ACLED, which uses media reported events. And it measures the number of events of violence against the informal sector in Africa. So you can see there's been a huge spike in the last 7 or 8 years. And some studies suggest that violence is disproportionately targeted to food vendors within the informal sector because their merchandise can be more easily disappeared, one could say. That the police officers can more easily eat your apple or your oranges or drink your fruit juice than they can hide dozens of textiles or plastic mops or electronics. So they're seen to be particularly vulnerable even within the informal sector. Among the many justifications for some of this harassment is food safety. So governments claim that street food and food prepared in informal markets may not be handled hygienically due to a lack of sanitation, lack of water, or waste disposal, may increase the risk of foodborne illness and the associated micronutrient deficiencies that come with that. But some epidemiological tests done by our sister center, IFPRI, in Kenya, so particularly on informal dairy and meat, has really shown that the risk is sometimes exaggerated. They found that bacterial content is really not significantly different between informal foods there and in the supermarkets there in Kenya. So I think there is a legitimate concern, definitely. But I think we also need to sometimes question the justification that governments are given for these crackdowns. So how can we manage the trade-offs? How can we support governments' attempts to have safe food for their consumers while not marginalizing an already extremely component of the population, the urban poor? So one policy that's been pursued, particularly in Kenya and in Nigeria, is food safety certification. So working with informal food vendors associations to help their members engage in training courses on safe handling practices in exchange for certificates that can be displayed to kind of ward off police, and as a way to share behaviors with some of their other colleagues in the informal sector. Another that's been used in Nairobi has been food safety mapping, so working with communities to identify hazards and sensitizing vendors about which places they shouldn't be selling food that might be dangerous environmentally. An option that I think is used actually much more in Southeast Asia is this idea of restricted tolerance, so allowing vendors to work for certain periods of the day in certain areas, contingent upon them cleaning up waste and cleaning up litter. And I think the fourth option is a much broader option, which is really more participatory engagement between street vendors and governments in redrafting vending bylaws. As I said, many of these date back from the colonial era, finding ways to have kind of negotiated compromise between the many informal food associations that are out there and with government actors. I don't know of many instances of this in Africa, though I know in Latin America there's been attempts to do this. So I think to conclude, I think we're at a really important turning point. Lots of opportunities now with the SDG 11 on inclusive cities, and as Shengen mentioned, also the UN's new urban agenda really offer an opportunity to push urban food security forward. And I think more than the typical kind of focus on urban development strategies, which typically just focus on infrastructure and transport issues, housing, et cetera, putting food forward as well. But I think we can't just focus on urban agriculture for some of the reasons that also Louise mentioned. I think returning to the proactive role that the informal economy has, and thinking of ways to harness that ability in a way that manages the sector in a much more humane manner. And this might involve thinking of ways to segment our approaches to the informal economy in major megacities, primate cities, versus secondary cities and towns. Because in the latter, you have many opportunities to think about infrastructure in terms of market stalls with proper sanitation facilities, et cetera, while you might need a different approach in already very developed megacities. Thank you.